So I want to introduce to you someone I have the pleasure of calling a friend. Jared Zimmer is with us tonight. He's our guest. He is the Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute. He's been there for several years now. He's been a big part of the building and launching of that organization. I'm sure he's going to tell you some things about that. He is a great speaker. He's an author, very effective evangelist. And most importantly, he is a proud husband and father of 6. You can look up pictures of him and his family on the internet. He is blessed with a beautiful family, and I know he's extremely proud of them. And so without further ado, thank you for being here, Jared. The floor is yours.
Yeah, my pleasure. And again, Mark, thank you for the invitation. And I was thinking about how long we've known each other, and you actually kind of, when my wife and I got married is whenever we kind of started to get to know each other. You were ministering to my brother actually at my parents' parish. And so I look back and I was like, oh, wow, that's 14 years ago. So time flies sometimes, but great to be with all of you. And I guess a little bit more about myself. So I am a local Texan. I'm from the Dallas area, north of Dallas. Went to a little small Catholic school just north of here, where I actually graduated with only 26 people. And I initially thought that perhaps I would go to be either a fireman or a coach, but God seems to have other plans for me. And so I started working in ministry, volunteering, and other things. And then I got brought onto a parish here in Grapevine, Texas. And I was there as the director of catechesis for about 5 years. And during that time, I started doing some speaking, some writing, and I actually had the opportunity to be introduced to the then Father Barron. This was after the Catholicism series had come out. He was at Mundelein Seminary at the time, and he brought me up to Mundelein to speak about evangelism, about particularly reaching young men today. And a couple of times, and we grew a pretty good friendship quite quickly in that regard. And one of the things that I was invited to actually was a meeting with the late Cardinal Francis George, who in many ways is the godfather, the spiritual grandfather of Word on Fire itself. He was the one that challenged Bishop Barron. He's the one that kind of had this vision of what Bishop Barron's work might be able to do. And so we started thinking about what was Word on Fire called to, and we wanted to see it move from a ministry to sort of a full-fledged movement, if you will, kind of like an ecclesiastical movement. And so we prayed about that, especially over the book of Acts of the Apostles. And for about a year and a half, we did that. And then one night I get a call from then Father Barron saying, I want you to be the guy to help me make these moves. So I took on the charge, and it's been a kind of wild ride ever since. We launched the Word on Fire Institute about 4 years ago, 3.5 years ago now. And it's grown in leaps and bounds. So it's been really a beautiful blessing from God to see the work of Bishop Barron moving in this direction, and to be a part of that. So along the way, I got my master's when I was still working at a parish, and I'm currently finishing my doctorate. All I have is my dissertation, so please pray for me in that regard that I can get it finished in time. But I want to talk to you today about evangelization. And I've got a little slide presentation here, but something that I always want to challenge people that are in the work of the church, that are in the work of the gospel, is we consistently have to take a look at how we're doing. And we have to kind of reevaluate, maybe restructure. How is it that things are working? What's not working? And the church for many years now has been asking for a sort of revamping, a new blood brought into this work of evangelization. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. You can see that? So at Word on Fire, something we talk about a lot, and in many ways, unfortunately, the term, the new evangelization, has become a little bit of a buzzword. But I like to return to what the church meant whenever it said the new evangelization, whenever it called for a new evangelization, and why it was so necessary to revisit what we mean by evangelization. So if you think about kind of evangelization in the past, it was going towards new lands, right? Oftentimes it was towards pagan lands or these other aspects, but people that were still kind of deeply mystical, people that still were deeply religious, they just weren't necessarily Christian. And so oftentimes the evangelists would come and it would be a kind of new message to people. But the reality of today is that we have whole swaths of people that have heard the gospel and either rejected it or just don't think it's all that important to their lives. So in many ways, it's kind of a post-Christian or perhaps a de-Christianized society that the new evangelization is new in the sense that we're going after this kind of new demographic that didn't exist even 150 years ago. This is a newer reality that we're dealing with today. In fact, Redemptoris Missio says that entire groups of the baptized have lost a living sense of the faith, or even no longer consider themselves members of the church, and live a life far removed from Christ and his gospel. In this case, what is needed is a new evangelization or a re-evangelization. Or as often my boss, Bishop Barron, says, it's new because rather than trying to woo a young maiden, we're trying to reanimate a relationship with a cynical divorcee. So it's a whole kind of different need for strategy, a different way to understand how to evangelize in the current culture. And what the church was asking for was really three aspects of this. The fact that it needs to be new in order, right? It's a return to the Pentecostal reality of this kind of fire within us to bring Christ to the world. If you think about whenever St. Peter gave his first kind of catechetical proclamation, the people that viewed it were so excited, and he was so excited that people thought they had literally been drinking. Like they were like, I want what he's having, right? But the message was so powerful that the people were cut to the heart, and thousands of people were baptized that day. And so it's a revisit to this kind of new desire, this new fire within the church to get back to our Pentecostal roots of the Holy Spirit alive and well within us. And because of that, and including the Second Vatican Council's call of the universal call to holiness, another aspect that's unique about the new evangelization is the fact that the laity play a very vital role in this new wave of evangelization. Evangelium Gaudium actually says that in virtue of their baptism, all of the members of the people of God have become missionary disciples. And I'm sure, as I know my experience was, and I'm sure all of you have had this experience even in your own parishes or schools or wherever you might be, oftentimes what happens is the pastor gets challenged to do everything. But the church is asking the laity to take a very vital role. They come to the church for the grace of the sacraments, for governance, for mission, and for guidance. But ultimately, the laity go out and they are the salt of the earth. They're the ones that are supposed to go into their professions or into their communities, into their homes of their families, and evangelize it from within. So when we receive the Eucharist, we're literally bringing Christ out to the world. And the new emphasis on that aspect of evangelization is part of this new evangelization. The second part of it is that they're asking us to have new in method. So what we mean by that is kind of recognizing the positive and unfortunately negative aspects of methods that we've used to catechize, to evangelize in the past. And when I was at St. Francis here in Grapevine, whenever we would do our catechist training, usually one of the first things I would ask new volunteers is, what was your catechesis like? What was your kind of upbringing in the church like when it came to either being evangelized or catechized? And typically it would boil down to about 4 different answers. One is the memorization technique. And so if you think about like the Baltimore Catechism or some of these others, which, don't get me wrong, I think memorization plays a serious role in regard to learning the faith. But what often happened is I knew the right answers to the right questions, but it wasn't really going from my head to my heart. I never really knew Jesus Christ personally. I never really knew kind of how to live out the faith. I knew the right answers, but it's a little bit kind of dislocated from my lived reality. The second aspect is that it was very focused on sacramental prep. And again, we need sacramental prep. This is, again, an important part of the catechetical training of children and as they become adults. But it was most often solely focused on the sacraments. And unfortunately, what we end up with is people who may not be ready for that level, or at least they haven't met Jesus first. And so they're hearing about the sacraments. For example, I used to run the marriage life part, so I was helping with sacramental prep and marital prep and all that. And I actually had a Catholic girl that was marrying a Protestant man. And usually the first session I would sit down and I would pray the Our Father with them. That's kind of a universal prayer that most Christians know. But unfortunately, the Catholic didn't even know the Our Father. And so I'm trying to do marital prep with this person, but they don't even really have the initial kind of fundamental prayer to know, which means they haven't been coming to Mass, they haven't been praying with their families, etc. But we tend to kind of see that as one of the other answers. The third, and this is borrowing a term from my father, is the catechesis of butterflies and balloons. That there was a lot of focus on the love of Christ and the love of others, but not a lot of theological or philosophical backing on that. It was kind of like a lot of just kind of fluffiness to it. And because of that, a lot of people just didn't take it seriously. My dad didn't, just as an anecdotal reality. It took actually Baptists challenging him in his faith to finally start thinking about it. He didn't really get the answers because it was in large part this kind of style of butterflies and balloons. And then the fourth one is usually more of a theoretical or an abstract type of theological catechesis with no really practical advice, right? So you might know one of the ways in which Thomas Aquinas proves the existence of God, but what does that necessarily mean for how I raise my children? Or what does that necessarily mean for how I participate in my business practice or things like that? It was kind of a lot of abstraction, but not necessarily lived reality of how to be a Christian in the world. And so what the church is asking is, let's take a look at what were the strengths and what were some of the weaknesses, and how can we kind of build on the strengths and start to avoid some of the weaknesses in that regard and come up with new methods on how to do it well. The third is new in expression. So by using the best means of teaching and expressing the faith, which includes the arts, the finest and most charitable rhetoric and engagement, and of course, the new media. Thank God for the ability to do this right now. And in large part, this is because of new media. But Bishop Barrett, the reason he even kind of got into this was because of new media, right? He gets into YouTube. He actually starts with movie reviews, and then it grows into what we now know with Word on Fire. And to recognize both the positives of new media, that there is a way to reach people that may not enter a church, but it's a way to get at least in front of them. But it can never make up for a relationship. It can never make up for that need for in-person conversation and growth together. So a question, and I'm going to have 2 or 3 slides here where I'm going to talk about sort of the universal reality of where we're at. So people that are unfortunately leaving, and I'm sure several of you probably know some of the statistics, but just to be frank, 50% of millennial Catholics identify as unaffiliated in this country. So if you think about, for the past 10, 15 years, kids who have gone through communion, through confirmation, about half of those are more than likely to leave the church. Granted, each parish is different, each diocese is different, but this is a universal, Pew-researched reality that is occurring. And so if we really are concerned, that's a big concern. 50% of those under 30 to 35 are leaving the church, and not even leaving to go to a different denomination. Most of them are leaving to become unaffiliated, meaning that they don't tie themselves to any religious affiliation. They're not necessarily atheists for the most part. It's more they're indifferentists. They just don't really care all that much. They don't see how it has anything to do with their life. So young people under 30 are 4 times more likely to leave the church than the generation before them. 25% of Americans, and this is just Americans in general, that's 80 million people, say they have no formal religion in this country. And again, that demographic kind of ranges between atheists versus just kind of indifferent. And then, of course, you kind of have some other kind of swaths or ideas of religion inside that as well. But we should be deeply concerned about this growing rapid exodus from the church. Just to express it anecdotally, as I mentioned, I went to a little small school in a small German Catholic town where there was about 1,200 to 1,500 people in the whole town. I graduated with 26 people. 8 of those 26 are now avowed atheists. And this is kind of the perfect situation of trying to keep people Catholic, which is nothing but Catholic families. Everybody went to church. There's a long tradition of Catholicism in the town. But even with that, you still had almost a third of that small class become atheists. I think there's many reasons for that, but just anecdotally, it's disconcerting for sure. So the question we have to ask them is, why are they leaving? Now, one of the projects under Pope Benedict XVI, when he was still the Pope, in 2007 there's this document called the Apricida document, and they did an entire survey of the Latin American and Caribbean bishops, handled their diocese, did a survey as to why people were leaving. And especially, in Latin America and the Caribbean, there's a long tradition of Catholicism there. And there, a lot of the people that are leaving are becoming evangelicals, non-denominationals, but a lot of them are also becoming unaffiliated as well. But it's an interesting document, and I would highly recommend reading the whole thing, but really it boils down to me to 4 specific reasons why people were leaving. And I think that honestly, this is a reflection of the universal experience that many people have. And so those 4 are that the faithful never experienced a personal encounter with Jesus Christ in the Catholic Church. 2, they never experienced the presence of meaningful community life where people are accepted and valued and included in the church. 3, they experienced elsewhere biblical and doctrinal formation, not as theoretical, but something that brings about spiritual, personal, and communal growth. And then 4th, they never experienced the missionary commitment that moves people from the pew to go out and meet those on the periphery to bring people home to the family of God. There was never this kind of outward-facing desire to bring people in. And I think, in many ways, like I said, it might be a little bit different in your experience or your parish, but I think we all know stories about how these are some weaknesses that we have in our parishes. But you want to know the number one reason that's always listed in Pew Research or several of these other church documents as to why people leave. It's that they just gradually drifted away and nobody cared. Right? So they never had that real connection with the church or the community or the theology or anything. They just left and nobody reached out. Nobody noticed. And I'm sure you all know how easy it is sometimes for people to slip through the cracks. It's just we run large parishes. We've got a lot of families. We've got a lot going on. But it's something that to really reflect on and pray about. Well, okay, how can we help that situation? How is it that we can help people understand that there is a community of believers here who want them there? And, there's other strategies to do that. And I think I'll kind of get into some in a minute, but that is consistently one of the number one reasons why people leave. So I think what we have, to be completely honest, is an identity crisis as a church. To throw yet another survey or a study towards this conversation, we've reached a point where, honestly, a majority of Catholics no longer really know the reason for the church's existence. If you saw that recent survey, about 2/3 of Catholics don't even really believe in the real presence of the Eucharist, which is the source and summit of our entire belief. The church exists to evangelize. That's why we exist. And back in 2005, there was a study that was done again, by Pew Research. And they went to different denominations and different demographics to ask them, how important is spreading the faith? So the faith you believe, the gospel you preach, how important is it to you and to your community to spread the faith? What amount of effort would you be willing to kind of give to that? And evangelical Protestants, about 75% of them said, yes, this is a deeply important part of my personal spirituality, of my church's spirituality. It's part of our mission. The language is constantly talking about reaching others, going out to the peripheries, etc. They went to an African American congregations, and about 57% of them said the same thing, that yes, this is an important aspect of my life, of how I understand Christ's commission for us to go out and bring people to a relationship with himself. But you know what happened whenever they asked Catholic parishes that number dropped to 6%. So if we exist to evangelize, if Christ's great commission is something that we are all supposed to partake in, but only 6% of our people even think that that's necessary, we've got a problem. Right. And it's interesting how about 7% of most parishes are involved in about 100% of the stuff going on. So the ones that are involved understand it, but we've got this great swath of people that are coming to Mass, and that's just about it. They don't really think about how to participate in that way. So then we have to ask the question, why are Catholics a little bit why are they afraid to evangelize? What's stopping them from going out and evangelize? And again, while each situation might be a little bit different, I do think there's kind of three things that people really struggle with. First is intellectual formation. So the confidence of knowing your faith, the confidence of actually striking up some of these conversations. I mean, if anyone here has tried to strike up a conversation about Jesus while you're getting a haircut or something, it's a little bit difficult. And if you don't have the kind of background of knowing the faith decently well, that you can have that conversation comfortably, people get scared. They fear they might be embarrassed, or they might not know what the right thing to say at the right time. And you can't blame them. I mean, that's a difficult reality, but it's a formation that goes beyond just the right answers to the right questions. It goes even into the necessity of a deep theological and philosophical formation. There's a lot of great books out there and some good stuff out there, but oftentimes what I see is a lack of actually going to the sources themselves. So why aren't our people reading Aquinas? Why aren't they reading John Henry Newman? Why aren't they reading Augustine or Chesterton or some of these other great intellectual giants, Edith Stein or some of the others? We're talking about people who practice in medicine, or people who are smart enough to do real things in the real world, to bring them in and challenge them to actually read the sources themselves. I think that's part of the lack here, that they don't quite get this kind of holistic understanding of the church and what it teaches. I also think that in many ways, I will echo Dr. Anthony Esselin, we have kind of lost a little bit of the formation in what he calls the human things. So why aren't Catholics reading Dante? Why aren't they reading Shakespeare? That's part of our tradition. It's part of who we are. And that stuff provides a common language of the human experience. So it provides the ability to express certain woes or joy or these other aspects of human existence that give us the language to talk to people that we're evangelizing. So maybe it doesn't always start with philosophy and theology. Maybe it just starts from the humane. It starts from the poetic. And it's a way to kind of gather or capture the imagination of the person in front of us. But very few Catholics are still reading that now. And I would challenge them, let's get back into it. Let's get back into the sources and it's our tradition. I mean, these people are created the Catholic Church as they helped, we're standing on the shoulders of giants with these folks, and we've got to get back to that. So without this kind of thorough catechesis and information, people just struggle with the confidence necessary to go out even the confidence of knowing where the resources are. A good evangelist is not the one that has all the right answers. A good evangelist is the one who knows where to find them most often, right? And through conversation and good relationship, you can go and find those good things. The second part, and I've kind of already mentioned one of the issues here, is a lack of community. And when I mean community, I don't just mean community in the sense of having small talk and enjoying a good coffee. Granted, I think that's a great thing, and we need to have that going on. But a community in the sense of the Acts of the Apostles, in which community members kept each other accountable. They would ask people, how is your relationship with Christ right now? This is something that evangelicals are actually quite good at. They ask you, how are you with Jesus right now? How are you fulfilling the mission of our church? They actually have those conversations, and then they keep each other accountable about it. They'll follow up with them later. Not really something we do very well in many Catholic parishes today. And then lastly, again, there's this idea of challenge, right? We've got to go forth, a sincere call to do the difficult things, to strike up those conversations, even if you don't feel fully confident you'll be able to answer all the questions. That's fine. But sometimes that first step, whether it's at Thanksgiving meal with your family and you have some non-believers in there, or if it's at the coffee shop, or if it's wherever, that first step of having your first open conversation about your faith. Sometimes that's what it takes, is a community that they know is going to support them, a community that they know they can go back to pray with, to go out and actually start striking up these conversations in the culture. So again, this is from Evangelii Nuntiandi. It says, evangelizing is in fact the grace and vocation proper to the church, her deepest identity. She exists to evangelize. So I think if we lose sight of that fact, if we think that we're just kind of a conveyor belt of souls going to heaven, there's so much more to it than that. We're participating in the very mission of God himself by bringing the good news of Jesus Christ to the world. So we've really got to focus in and think about areas in our own evangelical work, as well as at parishes and other aspects that we are involved in, and what things are occurring that are not outward focused. What aspects that, while good, need to be more evangelically focused, and how can we help that? Again, it's not to take away from this kind of communal need, but it's to say these communities exist to go out. And one thing I do want to say up front, and this was actually a question that was brought up earlier this morning, is when it comes to these communities, one of the things I highly recommend is the necessity of a charism inventory. So you may have people that aren't necessarily the type that can strike up conversations, aren't necessarily preachers of the word. They're more introverted, perhaps. That's fine. There's different levels and categories of evangelization. And one of the big ones I think every community needs, every parish needs, is sort of this foundation of like prayer warriors. People who know they're maybe not that comfortable with going out and striking up conversation. There's still a role to play. And then maybe they can start going to adoration for the mission. They can start going to extra masses. They can start offering up rosaries and chaplets for the mission of evangelization in your parish and in your community. One of the resources I definitely recommend is the St. Catherine of Siena Charism Inventory. It's very good. And it's just this kind of questionnaire that asks you what you're comfortable with, what's your background, do you like getting into dense theology, do you prefer relationship, building, all that kind of stuff, and it helps you kind of figure out your charism of sorts. And so again, I just want to make sure that we're talking about evangelization in its broadest sense, that everyone has a role to play, not just the preachers and not just those who can go out. So whenever we talk about getting into the work of evangelization, and I think this is part of what I did, and I think it's useful, hopefully, for you all in regard to training my catechists, especially at the parish. And what we tried to do is that I was also in charge of RCIA. As many of you know, we all wear 20 hats whenever we work for the church. And one thing that I would do is I would talk about certain assumptions that we have to be very, very careful of whenever we're evangelizing or catechizing. And so, for example, one assumption that can often happen is that we already think that maybe they've got some kind of proximate catechesis, meaning that they experience some kind of evangelization or catechesis in their own homes. We have often, where in most of the South especially, there's kind of this Christian culture here. But you'd be surprised when you start digging into people's family life, how little was actually done reading the Bible or praying together or anything remotely like that. And so we have to be careful not to assume that the adults or young adults or children are getting proximate catechesis in their own homes, that this is just naturally occurring. To bring up again, the Catholic young girl that was getting married didn't even know the Our Father, right? And so we have to be aware of our assumptions of that and not assume really much. We need to kind of dig into where people are at as they are. Also, the normality of family life. Oftentimes our experiences in life can affect the way we believe religion or affect the way we believe in God. So, for example, I had several people, whenever you do marital prep, we do this questionnaire, and one of them is like, how was your family life growing up? And oftentimes I would see the answer of, well, it was normal. And I'd have to have a follow-up conversation with, well, what do we mean by normal? And you'd find out that one of the parents was an abusive alcoholic, or there was several other issues going on. But for them, that's all they knew. They thought it was fine, which, okay, great. But we have to be very aware of the fact that even something like that, like how a person's relationship was with their own father and mother, can affect the way in which we speak about the loving fatherliness of God. And so recognizing that, our assumption of normality, we need to kind of dig in again on how we understand that. And then another one, of course, and I think this one is especially in regard to our leaders and our volunteers, is assuming a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. We assume a certain amount of prayer life. We often assume a certain amount of knowing Jesus personally, and we have to be very careful with that and be open and honest and vulnerable ourselves about our own relationship with Jesus Christ and how all of us at times can struggle, and our prayer lives can sway and move sometimes. But it's very, very important for our leaders and our volunteers to constantly look at how my relationship is with Jesus. I would say you cannot give what you do not have. So if you don't personally know Jesus as a friend, it's going to be very difficult to share that with people who we hope to evangelize. And then lastly, of course, an assumption that I see a lot is that they'll return for the sacraments, especially young couples. The assumption that they'll return for marriage or they'll return to baptize their children. And what I often found was the ones that return is because grandma was paying for the wedding. So they were coming because that was the only way that they'd get their wedding paid for. And research after research, study after study is showing that less and less young people are coming back to the church for these sacraments. So that's kind of a little bit of the kind of darkness of what's the situation, because I'm kind of taking like a doctor, I'm taking a scalpel to the reality of where we're at. But then how do we move forward? Right? How do we sort of correct and appropriate some of these issues? Well, I think in many ways, one of the best ways to really understand where a person is at in their relationship with the church, in their relationship with God, is through an authentic relationship with us as evangelists, as leaders, as catechists, not a relationship just to win this person for Christ or just to get them over the threshold of coming to Mass, but a thorough, authentic friendship, an actual friendship in which we're willing to give years of our time just to come to love and know this person and introduce them to the Christ that we know and love. And there's a great book by Sherry Waddell called Forming Intentional Disciples that I highly recommend. And in that, she actually lays out 3 thresholds of conversion. And this is all kind of within the umbrella of what I mean by authentic relationship, right? So when you have a relationship with someone, this first threshold is trust, right? So when you have a friend, one of the first things you really want to know of them is, can I trust you? And so if you think about this as the person you're trying to evangelize, they need to know, to their core, that they can trust you, that they can open up about their own lives, that they can trust certain information with you, that they can trust that you won't judge them whenever they tell you certain aspects of their life. And that trust takes time, because especially depending on the person, depending on their experiences, you never know how difficult it might be to gain that trust with an individual. One story that I share quite a bit. So my parents actually owned and operated a Catholic bookstore here in Denton, Texas for about 15 years. I worked there for about 9. In many ways, that was the school of hard knocks for me, to learn how to talk to people and do apologetics, because I had Satanists come in, I had atheists, I had Protestants that told me I was going to hell. I had all kinds of stuff that occurred to me. And it was great. I mean, I actually got to learn a lot and got to learn how to do this thing. But one of the things that happened during that time was, it was actually a day that I wasn't there. And this really large gentleman came in and actually stole some decently expensive rosaries. I think he stole 4 or 5 pretty expensive rosaries. And of course, my coworker wanted to call the police, but first she called my father, and my dad said, no, let's hang on. Clearly he was kind of seeking something, and I'll just take the loss. But please let me know if he ever comes back. And this gentleman ended up coming back about a week later, again, the same coworker. So she calls my dad over, and my dad almost immediately just walks up to him, introduces himself, and invites him to lunch, and just starts the relationship there. Well, come to find out, over the next 2 or 3 years, this man would start conveying his own story. And he had gone in and out of jail for 10 years. He had 2 children that were killed within about 2 years of each other. One was run over by an 18-wheeler. I mean, just horrific stuff. But it took that moment of vulnerability for my father to finally just sit down with him and get to know this man. He didn't know him from Joe Bob down the street, but he just knew this guy's seeking something. But because he didn't punish him, because he didn't judge him for his actions, this gentleman ended up trusting my father. And after several years of ups and downs and ins and outs, he finally ended up becoming a Catholic. But that next threshold, meaning curiosity, that fundamental reality of trust, with that gentleman, for example, there's no way he would have been curious about what my dad had to say should he have punished him right away, or should he have judged him right away. Instead, he knew he could trust him. And so therefore he became curious about, what is it that you believe? Why is it that you're running this bookstore? And then an openness to the truth that now my father could have this conversation, but it had to start with that initial reality of trust. Now, not all stories are going to be that kind of radical, but I think we can all recognize those kind of relationships that are just kind of talking about the weather, growing into a true friendship that you can trust each other with details about your spiritual life, details about your own life. And these thresholds are great ways to kind of understand why that's so necessary. Another thing or another story in my own personal life is, within relationship, you come to learn the individual's experiences, and you come to learn how they became who they are today. And in order to evangelize somebody, it's so important to know more about what they are, right? It's really important to know what they believe and all that, but also who they are as a person. And again, we have to be very, very careful not to judge a book by its cover or even behavior. I've got a very good friend of mine that we were best friends in high school, who we were actually in a band together for about 2 years, and he ended up deciding he wanted to make that a career out of his life. So he went into the heavy metal world. And if you saw him today, it's tattoos everywhere, more metal on his face than my toolbox probably, and get big gauges in his ears and dreads down to his waist, and the full on heavy metal thing. And so if you saw him at first, you might be a little bit kind of taken aback. But as you dig deeper, you'll find out that sadly, whenever I was a junior and he was a sophomore, his mother was killed by a drunk driver in a car, and my friend was actually in the car with her. So he saw the whole thing, and that put him on a trajectory of no longer trusting God. He didn't even believe God existed, because there's no way a good God could cause that kind of evil, or at least allow that kind of evil to occur. And so by the grace of God and many other people in his life, over the past about 2-3 years, he's kind of found his way back. He's now married, has a child, and is in good standing with the church and goes to church regularly. But if we were to judge him up front and not give him an opportunity to express himself through an authentic friendship, oftentimes we can get kind of lost in just trying to win people. And if he's not ready, it might take time. We're talking about years maybe to get this person kind of just at least willing to trust people again, willing to trust God again in many ways. Another way that we talk about a lot at Word on Fire is this idea of leading with beauty. Now, the reason this is important, and I'll get into some of the details and maybe a few practical tips on how to do it. As you know, we live in a very relativistic age, right? And if we think about the 3 different transcendentals, you've got truth, goodness, and beauty that the church teaches is transcendent. And this comes from traditional philosophy as well. Well, in a relativistic age, if you start with truth, let's say the truth of God, a person might say, well, that's true for you, but not necessarily for me. If you start with goodness, say morality or a moral code, well, they might say, well, that's fine for you, and I'm glad you're happy, but it's not necessarily my thing. But beauty is something that is universally recognized, and honestly, as long as it's authentic beauty, not really something you can argue, right? So like if you were to take an atheist to the Sistine Chapel, they can't really argue that that's not beautiful, right? And so what happens is beauty creates this commonality, this place of agreement before you potentially get into anything that you might disagree. So Hans Urs von Balthasar called it an arresting quality. This kind of desire to fight against one another, to kind of get into this, kind of combative mode, kind of falls by the wayside when it comes to the beautiful. But what does this really look like practically speaking, right? Well, in my RCIA program, something I used to do a lot is beauty provides this kind of real kind of expression of the faith. So for example, if we were talking about the Transfiguration, I would have an icon of the Transfiguration, whether it was a reel or maybe we'd pull up just a picture. And we do this kind of Lectio Divina style of just contemplating the image as the doctrine is being explained. And so looking at the different aspects of the icon and what the iconographer actually placed in there to be more catechetical. It's a way in which we can kind of open up the reality that this isn't just wordplay. We're talking about real things here with a long tradition of belief. In fact, this goes, the church, since time immemorial, has been talking about the use of beauty, but actually in 1563, during the Council of Trent, they actually addressed the role of sacred art, and it said, by means of the stories of the mysteries of our redemption, portrayed in paintings and other representations, the people are instructed and confirmed in the articles of the faith. These images ought to be borne in mind and constantly reflected on. And Pope Francis actually echoed this in Evangelii Gaudium when he says, every form of catechesis would do well to attend to the way of beauty. Proclaiming Christ means showing that to believe in him and to follow him is not only something right and true, but also something beautiful, capable of filling life with new splendor and profound joy, even in the midst of difficulties. And something that we do, we think about with Word on Fire, is actually leading with beauty in regard to the culture itself. So one example is the use of movies, right? There are certain movies that are just great movies. Whether you're a believer or not a believer, just fantastic movies. Bishop Barron uses the Coen brothers a lot because there's a lot of kind of, he calls it Christ hauntedness in these movies. That you're able to express a common language with someone through something beautiful, like a great film. And then from there, you can now start talking about the moral order of that film and what was good and evil in that film, right? And then from there, you can get into the true. You can get into that which is kind of objectively true, whether expressed or not in a certain film. So I've come to find that music and movies and books, it's another way to lead with beauty. And another way is through your own relationships, through you as an example of somebody who is deeply in love with Jesus Christ through the Catholic Church. That's another excellent way to lead with beauty. So as I said, beginning with the beautiful leads to the good, which then leads to that which is true. Now, the important thing here is to recognize how, and I'm going to get to this in a little bit, how to recognize in an individual where they might be. Maybe they're actually ready for the truth. Maybe they're actually ready to kind of have that conversation about the good. Fantastic. We can get into that, but I'll get into that a little bit more here in a second. And I do want to, there we go. It looks like unfortunately, my wife fell off the screen here. But the absolute necessity of community, I keep bringing that up throughout this because I think it's absolutely vitally important. And, sometimes we have groups at parishes or schools or these other places that, well-meaning folks who find a great community with each other, but it becomes closed off. You end up with kind of these little private clubs, unfortunately, that other people aren't necessarily brought into. And granted, I know this is an aspect of community, this is a way of community, but I would challenge people to constantly be looking outward, constantly be looking for other ways to bring people into the group, whether it's through a mutual interest or whether it's through mutual desire to serve or something. There's ways in which you can get those who are not part of the group in the group, so long as the group is naturally, by its own ethos, looking forward and always trying to bring more and more people in. The beauty of community is that what happens is, so there's this fantastic book by Father James Mallon that I highly recommend called Divine Renovation. And in that, he actually gets into these things that he calls the 3 B's, right? So the first kind of process of someone joining the Catholic Church is belonging. So actually having a community of believers that they come together and they know they belong. They know that this is our community. They're not there to judge them. They're just there to love and be friends with them, right? From there, it's believing. Sometimes they can get a little, mixed and intertwined and things like that. But from there, it should start with belonging, believing, and then behaving, right? But what often happens is we say, you can't join until you behave. And then when you behave, you'll start believing, and then you can belong to a community. But the right way is you belong with us first. You're welcome here. We'll talk to you about what we believe, and we'll help you understand. And then from there, we hope that the kind of morality will start to play itself out in your life. You'll start to truly experience this metanoia, this change, this conversion of heart towards living the code or living the life of a life in love with Christ and fulfilled by the Holy Spirit. So what I like to do is actually look at the catechumenal model of St. Augustine. As you all know from the RCIA process, that's the catechumenal model. In the past, it was almost 3 years. It's been shortened more recently. And actually, I'm seeing more and more parishes have a catechumenate that's year-round, which I love to see that. But what I do is kind of pair that with John Henry Newman's illative sense. So if you've never read Newman's idea of illative sense, basically what he's saying is that for a person to go from not believing something to believing something, so the process of assent to a truth, it's not typically just one argument that gets them there, right? Very rarely have you been in like a debate or an argument with somebody, and then eventually somebody just says, well, doggone it, you're right, right? That just doesn't happen that often. Instead, it's a conglomeration and a process of argument, but also relationship, hunches, gut feelings, moments of insight, moments of silence that something comes to you. It's this whole kind of process of recognizing how God's working in this person's life, and how God gets them to an ascent, and all these other actors and players and relationships and hunches and experiences and arguments that might come together to help a person ultimately ascent to a truth. But I think that what the catechumenal model allows is to help us understand what that process is and what it might take to get to a full ascent of everything that the church teaches. So, of course, the catechumenal model, the first one being the kerygma. So oftentimes, unfortunately, what ends up happening is we might start with the didache, or the official teaching of the church. This person hasn't really heard the kerygmatic expression of the gospel. They haven't heard that initial moment of what Jesus has done for us and what that salvific message means for us. And so we need to start in the proper reality of starting at the beginning, and recognizing what a person may or may not need in that moment, recognizing that they might need to hear just the basic gospel message because they've never heard it well. Maybe they've heard it and it just didn't stick, or maybe they actually heard it bad. And so recognizing that through that kind of how the illative sense works, not just argument, but relationship and experiences and these other ways in which God works in our life. The next piece, of course, is metanoia, sort of Mother Teresa constantly talking about an expectation of conversion. I know God is going to work in the lives of those who hear the gospel. And so recognizing little moments of that actual turn towards conversion, turn towards more curiosity, more openness, talking about those thresholds of relationship or of conversion. And sometimes metanoia, as much as I wish we could all have a St. Paul moment of falling off the horse, most of us take years to do that, right? And we constantly, all of us here, are constantly in need of refreshed metanoia, refreshed conversion to Jesus Christ, of a constant turning towards him, because we're all sinners. But in those we're hoping to evangelize, recognizing the moments along the way of more curiosity, more openness to the fullness of the truth. And then, of course, the next piece is the actual didache, the formal teaching, the systematic teaching of theology, of philosophy of the church, really getting into the meat of what the church teaches. Sometimes, unfortunately, we can find ourselves starting here whenever we need to start with kerygma, with conversion of life, with getting people to understand that Jesus loves them personally. And so the illative sense in a way is, along with this catechumenal method, catechumenal model, is a way in which we can start recognizing where people are at on this spectrum, and help them get to where we want to be, and understanding that what we're doing is creating the conditions for the possibility of the Holy Spirit working in their life. That's what we're called to do as evangelists, is to create those conditions so that the Holy Spirit can do his work. So I want to emphasize three aspects of need for evangelization. First one is personal holiness. As I said, we cannot give what we do not have. If we don't know Jesus personally, if our prayer life is not great, really take a serious look at it and be vulnerable with yourself. Be honest with yourself. It's okay. Be honest with your pastor. Be honest with your confessor. It's perfectly fine to be in a place of struggle with this, but it's better to recognize it than cover it over and pretend like no problems exist, right? But personal holiness, our own sacramental life, our own relationship with the church, we've got to strive, 100% to do that. And a quick recommendation of a book that I have here, it's called The Soul of the Apostolate. And it's by Jean-Baptiste Chattard, which it's all about the spiritual life of those who are active in the work of the church, those who are active in the work of God, and how important and necessary and central that is to our work. In fact, Evangelii Nuziandi, specifically talking about evangelists, says, techniques of evangelization are good, but even the most advanced ones could not replace the gentle action of the Spirit. The most perfect preparation of the evangelizer has no effect without the Holy Spirit. Without the Holy Spirit, the most convincing dialectic has no power over the heart of man. Without him, the most highly developed schemas resting on sociological or psychological basis are quickly seen to be quite valueless. So again, we are conduits of grace. We're conduits of the Holy Spirit out into the world. So it's absolutely necessary to really focus in on our own prayer lives, our own relationship with Jesus. The next part, of course, I really want to emphasize the necessity of having families who are evangelists. Many families struggle with what it means to evangelize in their own home. Most families have never heard the terminology of domestic church. Most families, in many ways, are trying to create an environment of holiness, of prayer, but they have no idea where to start because they themselves, as the parents or the couple, never had it themselves. So they don't know things like a great thing to do is actually to find a place of prayer that's right smack dab in the middle of the home. So it's a kind of Christocentric reality of the home. Christ is the center of this house. And oftentimes what that allows is that maybe the mother and father kind of struggle with starting up the rosary because they've never done it with their kids, or they struggle with starting up reading scripture with the kids because there's this kind of that awkward transition, or maybe the kids are old enough to kind of push back a little bit. But if there's this place where there's already a recognition of the holiness of the family, there's already a recognition that Jesus is king of this house, it gives them more confidence to say, let's go to our prayer space. Let's open up the scriptures and just spend 5 minutes talking about scriptures for a minute. It's those little practical things like that. Many did not grow up in a home that had that kind of experience. So to help people understand the necessity of, especially within the family, of evangelization. John Paul II said, when the Christian family takes up the task to be what it is, a living icon in our world of God's own communion, the family stands at the heart of the church's mission of evangelization. And when the family responds in the way to the design of the Creator, it truly becomes a domestic church. So I know a lot of churches are actually leaning towards more of a family catechetical style, and I love that. I think that's absolutely needed. There's so many parents who themselves need good catechesis, and sometimes the way to do that is actually with and through their children, to help them understand why that's necessary for them to know the faith just as much as their children. So as much as possible, when you're doing your programs, when you're doing your events, think family, And then last, of course, culture. And something we say a lot at Word on Fire is you cannot evangelize a culture you do not love. And culture provides, again, kind of a common language through which we can express the faith. I've been involved, just kind of my own personal story, I've been involved in sports and physical activity for a long time. My undergrad is actually in kinesiology. I competed in powerlifting and bodybuilding, and actually recently did a Scottish Highland Games, and I've done Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and several other things like that. That's kind of one of my passions. But that culture that I love it. It gives me an opportunity to speak to people on the common language of a mutual love of a culture. And then from there, that relationship starts. It's a great way to start those thresholds of conversion, to start moments of trust with people. And it doesn't have to be physical activity. It can be, I like good cups of coffee. They like good cups of coffee. We happen to go to the same coffee shop. Why not strike up a conversation with them? I see them on a regular basis. Just, start it in that sense. So oftentimes, if God has placed something on in our own charism, in our own heart of, I love this aspect of culture, whether it's movies or sports or coffee or, I don't know, you name it, they create wonderful mutual loves to create, again, that basis of agreement rather than disagreement. But often, too, we have to be very careful I know as Christians, we need to be aware of the kind of culture that we're taking in personally or that we're taking into our homes. But at the same time, we need to know what's going on in the culture. We need to know what movies are popular, what music is popular, why is it popular, what is it doing? Is it just vapid, or is there actually a message here that I can kind of grab onto and use that to create good conversation, good mutual language? It can't be a culture of us versus them. Christians operate within and bring salt to the earth within the culture. And if we see the outside culture as vehemently opposed to what we are, you're just not going to find that commonality. You're going to start from a place of disagreement, which is not a great place to get going. So again, as I said at the beginning, what we need is a new Pentecost. We need a refreshment of the Holy Spirit within us. We can't do that without being personally holy. We can't do that without wonderful, holy families striving to live out the church's teaching. And we can't do that if we're not expressing ourselves through common language, through cultural realities. So Pope Benedict XVI once said that, I therefore believe that we must make an effort above all to listen to the Lord in prayer and deep interior participation in the sacraments, and learning the sentiments of God in the faces and the suffering of others in order to be infected by his joy. So I hope that what you take away from this is that at the heart of what it means to be a Catholic, to express that, means to be an evangelist. We are called to go out and spread the good news of Jesus Christ, whether it's preaching or not, whether it's just small acts of love. That's what we're called to do as a church. So that's the end of my little presentation here, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Everybody, feel free to go ahead and start jumping in. Just unmute yourself at will and ask away.
Jared, do you have any other resources, books, anything like that to just continue to dive deeper, just to steep ourselves in this, whether that's something for us or to recommend to someone we're trying to help form into an evangelist, into a disciple?
Yeah. How long you got? Because I got a long list. I'll reiterate the three that I mentioned in my presentation. So Forming Intentional Disciples by Sherry Waddell, The Soul of the Apostolate by Jean-Baptiste Chattard, and Divine Renovation by Father James Mallon. I think those are great starting points for that. I would also recommend the St. Catherine of Siena Charism Inventory. It's great for just personal growth, understanding what our role might be. But then I would also recommend Bishop Barron's book, Word on Fire. And it just is such a good perspective of how to preach in the modern world. He's got a lot of insights in there on how to kind of understand the modern world and speak to and through it. I can send a list if you'd like. I can actually send Mark a list of books that I would highly recommend, and he can send it out to everybody if you prefer. I'm just kind of blanking on some of the names right now. So.
The Sherry Waddell book, I said this morning, is definitely worth a read. I have not actually read Divine Renovation. I have it on the shelf. Everybody's, I'm sure, here has a bigger bookshelf than they've actually read. So I don't feel too bad about it. I'm sure Jared hasn't read every one of those books behind.
Oh, yeah. No.
But that Waddell book is fantastic. So definitely worth the read. I'm sure that all of them are. Anyone
Okay,
else?
Mark, this is for you and Jared. Mark, you mentioned something about, and Jared just did also, about catechizing the parents as well as the children, and this is being done as a community effort. What resources do you have for that?
Well, to start off with, there's actually a catechetical series by Sophia Institute Press,
Okay.
called A Family of Faith.
Okay.
And they're using that at St. Joseph in Shreveport. Trey, I'm sure, could tell you a little more about that than me. and Genevieve is their DRE. In fact, I have personally asked her, can people call you? And she said, yes, tell them they can call me. If you have questions, she would love to talk to you about how they've used it and implemented it and probably challenges they've faced. That's the only program I know of that is specifically designed for that. Jared, what do you got?
Yeah, that's the only one I know as well. But something that I've seen done extremely well is you still have basically one event or one aspect per week that the whole family comes, and you still kind of have moments where they're together as a family, but then you do split them up. You still have the adults go to one area, the kids go to another area, and the teens go to another area or whatnot. But the purpose is that they're all teaching the same thing. So they're all focused on the same doctrine or the same, whatever they might be teaching, moral or whatever it might be. But the parents are doing it on a much higher level and et cetera, et cetera. But then at the end, what often happens was they just hung out and had coffee and biscuits and just chilled together and just had a good time, let the kids play together. And the one thing I know that came up this morning as well is what happens when parents do a pushback. Something that I've seen done really well is, one, for the first year, not making it mandatory for the parents, making it optional for them, but highly recommending it to them, and maybe doing a little presentation for them at the beginning of the year as to why it's so important that families are involved in this and why the parents are the primary catechists of their children. But then two is maybe not every week like you do with like sacramental prep, but you have maybe 6 throughout the year of the whole family comes. And then you start bringing in the parents. And then over time, you start having more and more interest in people coming in. So it's kind of like a 5-year plan rather than like next year type of deal. I also once heard about a parish who they gathered their leaders. It was about 5 couples. And they charged those couples with actually personally reaching out to the couples who weren't coming. And inviting them to go have coffee. Just say, hey, I know we both go to the same parish. Our kids are in the same program. I'd love to just invite you to coffee, get to know you. Even if it's just meeting here, that's fine. Just to, on campus or whatever at the parish. But they're your marketers / evangelists of the program itself. So what often happens is they say how much they love it, how much they're getting out of it, things that have happened in their family because they've been going. So rather than the leader themselves, it's actually kind of a covert style of doing it. But I've seen it work really, really well.
Who's next? I see Father Dwayne unmuted himself. Father, were you wanting to chime in?
Well, I would. Thank you, Mark. I am relatively new to Holy Trinity Catholic Church, and I see that one of the members of our pastoral council is online here, so he might be able to supplement what I'm saying. But one of the things that we're trying to do in response to what you spoke about in terms of engaging in self-development is to take the 4 dimensions of formation that's a model for priestly formation and reevaluate those so that they can be asked of individuals and families and all the really ministries of our parish. And the goal would be to assure everything we do in our parish life is well balanced. That's a model that would allow any parish to assess their progress, evaluate new initiatives. And some of the things you spoke about in particular is how often are people engaging in the great works of St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine and so on. But relating that to the dimensions of formation, I would call that human formation, which is more than just proper self-care. That's about fostering virtues. Are we really engaged in the culture of our city, the arts, humanities? Are we welcoming each other to Mass? Grace builds on nature, and so if we're fundamentally growing in the dimension of human formation, I think that's a really good way to address what you were saying. And it also overlaps with what you might call intellectual formation, which really refers to the questions of what am I consuming on TV and music and movies, the internet, other entertainment? Am I staying attuned to the current events of the world, of the church? Am I constantly being informed? And really, do I participate in the events going on in my own parish? parish missions, nights of reflection, things about special events for children that go on in the parish. And I think if we as pastors challenge people to engage in these areas of personal development, personal formation, that really goes a lot further than just an academic exercise. It really promotes the health of the parish. So that's kind of what we're doing here. And I was so happy to hear you say that, because when you speak of Evangelium Nuntiandi and other encyclicals and apostolic exhortations, I'm afraid that we even use those words too loosely, because many of the people of our parish say, wait, what? What is an apostolic exhortation? And you touched on that too, just not assuming everyone has a basic degree of formation from their home, but to draw them in without using these big words and without necessarily naming the documents, other than to just talk about the content. I don't mean to go on, but I really resonate with what you said, Jared, especially with regards to every person has a duty to be self-informed about the culture, the world, the church. And when everybody's doing that, the whole church grows.
Yeah. Yeah. My main response to that is amen to that. And I absolutely love taking those 4 dimensions of what's taught in seminarian formation in that regard. Something that came to my mind, I wrote my master's thesis on Thomas Merton, and I was actually looking at how it is that he was able to reach the modern world when he did. And in some of his earlier works, he's very clearly challenging people to this kind of thing of self-discipline, self-awareness, motivating themselves to really take the mind, body, and soul relationship very seriously, discipline in all those capacities. And when I did that thesis, I was looking at the modern world today, post-Merton, and seeing where in the popular culture is this kind of language being done. And there's actually the #1 podcast in the world by Jocko Willink, who's an ex-Navy SEAL, telling people constantly, get up at 4:30, read difficult books, do difficult things, and people are all over it. His is kind of more of like a traditional stoicism, but people want that challenge, and they want to know there's a purpose to it, that I'm not just doing this for kind of a hamster on a wheel. Like, this is about, as you said, virtue. It's about building ourselves. So I love that. That's fantastic.
You might also take this moment, Jared, to plug a resource that parishes can utilize via Flocknote.
Yeah. So if you are unfamiliar with one of our products called Word on Fire Engage, we partnered with the folks at Flocknote, which I would imagine several of your parishes might already have. And what that is it's a content distribution tool. It can be either email announcements or something of that nature. But what we've done is partnered with them, and we actually created content specifically geared to go towards the other 80% that are difficult to reach while you're at Mass. Most parishes on a good level reach about 40 to 50%, maybe 30% of your actual registrants of your parish come to Mass. And so you don't get them once a week or once a month to reach them. But what this does is it creates a digital way to reach them via email or even text message. And so you can actually add in, we've got a whole system set up that's very user-friendly, very easy to do. You just might have to have somebody on your pastoral staff, or if you have a communications team, wonderful. But we now have a full-time fellow here, Bobby Angel, that oversees the whole Word on Fire Engage program. And so as an example, whenever the restrictions started to lift in several of the states and people were starting to go back to Mass, Bishop Barron did a short challenge of people got to get back to Mass. And what we did was film 5 more 3-minute reasons as to why it's important to go back to Mass that included 5 different faces. And then we created 6 weeks worth of content that would be sent out to all of your parishioners, all 100% of your parishioners via email or text message, and they can choose how they want the information, whether it's via phone or email. But it can be very quick. We can also do catechetical stuff. So we had one parish that we've got these little mini courses in there. One's a mini course on the existence of God. So what they did was, okay, for 6 weeks during the beginning of RCIA, well, this is what we're already talking about. We're going to be sending this out to the rest of the parish. And the pastor himself started doing homilies on the existence of God and saying things like, check your phones, more information's coming during the week. So it's a wonderful product for parishes and be able to get that other 80% that aren't necessarily always at Mass. So you can find out more if you just kind of go to wordonfireengage.com.
I'll re-ask a question I asked this morning that I really liked your answer to, and I think everyone here would benefit from. Since we're coming out of the pandemic, hopefully, many of our parishes are at least desiring to take this opportunity to sort of reset and move forward in a better way than perhaps they were before. And so if you could just talk about some of those practical tips that you have seen or perhaps implemented yourself, that parishes can start with to start down a new path. And I worded it better.
I think on the more practical side of things, I think it's really important for us to know our parishes well, who our people are, what their demographic is, what they believe, what they don't believe. So I highly recommend doing a survey of some kind. I would imagine almost all of your parishes have at least one person there that probably does that in some professional capacity that might be willing to give of their time and talent to do so. And also these surveys typically can just be an online questionnaire. And for about a month, you focus in on getting all of your parishioners, at least those that want to participate, to start participating in this kind of survey of the parish. And you can make it anonymous so that they're more than comfortable to tell you, I don't really believe in the real presence of the Eucharist, or whatever might be out there. You can pick your, kind of 10 main questions you really want to know. It can be demographic information and then get right into the beliefs. But in many ways, what those surveys can provide is information on where do I need to focus, right? So if I've got a huge, say half of my parish doesn't really believe in the real presence of the Eucharist, I better focus in on that, and everything can surround that reality to help that situation. It can also give you an opportunity to see who might be willing to volunteer, who isn't currently volunteering. So you can just have that one little checkbox of, you can reach out to me for any volunteer opportunities, and this is what I might be interested in, service or teaching or whatever it might be. It's another way to kind of get that as well. Other than that, I would definitely say having a solid leadership team in your parishes. And sometimes maybe even before you do this survey, spend a couple of months taking a serious look at your own spiritual lives, the spiritual life of your parish. Take time to go together to adoration. Take time, maybe ask your pastor or pastors here, be willing to do kind of mini retreats with your team on the weekends or whenever it might be best for you guys. It gives you an opportunity to kind of reset spiritually, much like in the upper room, to kind of think about what is this parish asking us to do? What is the Holy Spirit asking us to do? And then from there, some of these kind of practical things of surveys and taking and I would even say survey your mission or your ministries themselves. There's a lot of time out there that we use and money out there that we use for ministries that are great in and of themselves, but are they evangelical? Are they outward focused? And how can we help provide either resources or training or some type of thing to help them be more outward focused? And that can be the bingo folks or the people who have like a men's and women's groups. That's, all the ministries. Just take a good solid look at them and just be open and honest with it, and help it to kind of using these resources that we've mentioned to be much more evangelically focused. And to use Father's example, all of those ministries participating in something like that, where they're all kind of recognizing those 4 dimensions of formation and all that stuff. I don't see why every ministry ought not have some type of formation in them. If they're just getting together to hang out, I mean, that's good, I guess, because it does create community, but there should be some kind of gear towards formation, whether it's like total kerygmatic. Like we know we exist to preach the basic gospel to people. Wonderful. Because now whenever you've got evangelists in the church, they know which group to connect them with and where to go. But, oftentimes that just kind of coffee time is great, like I said, but it can be limited. And I think that if we're going to do this as a church, we've all got to be focused on evangelization.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Jared, can you talk a little about hope? All the dreadful statistics and percentages and all that. Can you share a little bit about the hope of the future?
Yeah, I mean, I share a lot of those dire statistics, but there's actually a lot of good going on as well. Some of the ministries that I've seen grow and some of the lives that have changed. And one thing is that as Catholics, we are a global reality. So maybe in the West, we're struggling, but that's not the case everywhere else. The church is growing in leaps and bounds in other places. And so we're in this weird post-modernity here in the West that we have a different style and need of evangelization. But the gospel is nothing but hope. That's what we are called to participate in. Sometimes it can be difficult because we're operating in that dire situation. But hold fast to that inner life. Hold fast to the interior life, your prayer life. Oftentimes what happens is when we talk about faith, hope, and love, hope does get overlooked. We look at faith and we look at love, but hope oftentimes is a theological virtue. We don't talk about it all that much. Of course, we're big von Balthasar people here, so we talk about it a lot. I think that an evangelist has to be hope-filled. If he truly believes in the gospel and believes that Jesus rose from the dead, he can't help but be hope-filled. He can have moments of feeling defeated, but that's not the same thing as not being hope-filled. So I don't know if I can give a much bigger answer than that one, but I would definitely say hold fast to it,
One more, I think. This is your last chance.
I don't have a question. I just have a comment. Jared, I took pages and pages and pages of notes, and I've thoroughly enjoyed, and you've actually made me very hopeful.
Wonderful.
So thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
It's quite a compliment.
All right. Since that wasn't technically a question,
go ahead.
I'll throw out a softball. So you have, Jared, you have 6 kids. Congratulations. That's great. If you wouldn't mind sharing the age ranges, and I apologize if I missed that at the beginning. But then how do you find time to work out? Do those things, bodybuilding, you involve the kids. It's just, I think so my wife and I are, we have 6 kids too. And I think that's what we struggle with as far as catechizing our children and, getting involved in the parish. But it's even just spending time with each other or just taking care of ourselves physically and spiritually as well. So what would you recommend for folks like us?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. And so 6 kids, as you know, then it's chaos, but it's a beautiful chaos. And what my age ranges are, my oldest is 13, my youngest is 3, and we have 4 boys and 2 girls. So it's a wonderful little family. For my wife and I, 2 things that we got very practical with. One was we spent a little money up front to start having enough equipment in the garage that we can get a solid workout in. Secondly is prioritizing self-care. So often we self-sacrifice and praise God because that's part of our mission and our vocation. But if you're not in a place of self-care, to Father's point of, if we're not looking at our own growth as a person, and that includes mind, body, and soul, you're not going to do that, that great, or you're not at your utmost with your kids. And so what my wife and I have been able to do especially whenever it comes to catechizing our own children. Most of it happens in the evening. And one of the things that we do is we actually pray the Liturgy of the Hours with our children. So in the evening, we do evening prayer with them. And if you go on YouTube, you can actually just look up Liturgy of the Hours chanted. And then there's this one guy that's doing it right now that it's fantastic. And the kids are drawn in, there's beautiful pictures and the words are actually on the screen and all that kind of stuff. But in many ways, that prayer itself is catechetical. So the kids are saying it, they're repeating these phrases, they're repeating the Psalms. So it's a way in which we personally have come to find that has worked well with them, but also something that has worked well is that my kids, we created this environment that my kids know that if I have a question about the faith, I can go to my parents. And regardless of whether or not I know the perfect answer to give right away, I can sit down with them and we can talk about it. We can have a conversation about it. Sometimes even at the dinner table, I'll ask, what's something you guys heard at Mass this week that really kind of struck you or something you're confused about? And, it could be something like had nothing to do with the Mass, had nothing to do with the homily, but they're like, so do angels eat? Little things like that create the conditions for good conversation around that stuff. But I guess the underlying reality of both self-care and catechizing your kids and creating good Christian homes is intentionality. Really sitting down and thinking about what's important to us and how can we prioritize those things. Now, that does mean, especially when it comes to physical stuff, I'm usually up at like 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and that's when I get my workout in. It's the only way I can do it. And then my wife typically does in the evening after dinner. I'll bathe the kids, do some other things while she gets to do hers. And we also find out good routines that we're not doing it every single day and, things like that. So it's possible. I'm not saying we're perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think in the trying, that's where God gets to work.
Good stuff. All right. Well, we're kind of out of time. I really want to just thank everyone for being here. It's been a pleasure. I know, like you, I have benefited much from this convocation. Thank you, Jared, for taking the time out today, this morning and this evening. I've learned a lot from you already just in these 2 sessions, like Jackie, taking a lot of notes and have a lot to go and read up on and meditate on. So we might want to bring you back at some point. So I may be calling you at a later date to do something else, and keep us in your prayers. We'll keep you in ours. And I guess that concludes our convocation. So thank you all again for being here and have a good night.